Thank you all for coming. My name is Walter Edwards. I am the director of the Humanities Center. Howard and I are denizens of the second floor of FAB, and we run into each other constantly. And I am delighted that every now and then I get a chance to participate in some of the programs of his center. And he's always an upbeat, very busy young man. And I'm delighted that he has honored our series by agreeing to speak. He only sent us a very short bio. He's a very modest man, so I'll just read. But please know that this is just an abbreviated version of a very distinguished academic career. He is a fourth generation Detroiter and a graduate of the University of Michigan and Columbia University, where he earned a PhD in Jewish history. He is currently Associate Professor of History and Director of the Cohen-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies here at Wayne. He has also been around at prestigious universities. He has taught at Cornell University, Colby College, the University of Western Ontario, and the University of Michigan, where he was also a fellow of the Frankel Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies. He is the author, most recently, of the book entitled Jews and Judaism in World History, and he completed a history of the Jews of Budapest, and is currently working on the politics of progressive Jews in Hungary and the Habsburg Empire from 1848 to 1918. Howard is the 2009 winner of the Bernard L. Mass Prize for Achievement in Jewish Culture and Continuity in the area of humanities. So today he will talk to us on this topic. This topic is Jewish Immigrants and Refugees, Historical Perspectives and Contemporary Lessons. So please welcome to the virtual podium, Professor Howard Lupovitch.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see everybody. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, Kennedy. Thank you, Walter, for sponsoring me. Like Walter said, it's always a pleasure for me and the Cohen-Haddow Center to do things together with the Humanities Center. It's one of those nice perks about being at Wayne is you get to work with some very, very nice people. And thank you also for referring to me as a young man. It happens less and less. And well, I really, if I haven't heard it in a while, but thank you. I appreciate it. So this afternoon, as Walter said, I want to talk about, in a larger, broader strokes, I want to talk about Jewish immigration, Jewish migration, both past, in the distant past and in the recent past and in the 20th century. And while my topic is specifically Jewish migration, and what I want to underscore is that what I have to say today, it'll be possible to, what I say specifically about Jews today, it'll be possible to infer things about other groups and their migrations, and particularly with respect to 20th century Jewish migration. Not only do we see lessons that can be inferred, but also some striking parallels to even more recent and contemporary migration movements. So the first thing I would say is that on that first glance, one might think that the topic of Jewish migration is not really a present day topic, because for the most part, Jews don't migrate that much anymore, certainly not as much as they once did. So the largest centers of Jewish life in America, in Israel, most of the Jews living in both of these places have been there for a considerable amount of time. For American Jewry, the one notable exception, of course, is Jews from the former Soviet Union who came during the 1990s. There was also an influx of Jews from Iran after 1979, but for the most part, at the beginning of the 21st century, the vast majority of American Jews are third generation or even fourth generation. So we're several generations removed from Jewish immigration. Nonetheless, it is still fair to say that the issue of migration is a core issue in the study of Jewish history. From antiquity to the present, migration has been woven into the fabric and the dynamics of Jewish history from antiquity to the present. And I want to just give you a couple of examples. First, the word Hebrew, which of course is the term that we use to refer to the precursors of the Jews in biblical times. The Hebrew word for Hebrew, Ivri, comes from a word which means to cross or to traverse, and it has the connotation of movement. So the first Hebrew in the Bible, of course, was Abraham, and Abraham was someone who migrated from somewhere in Iraq to eventually reaching the land of Canaan. And he is the first in a series of migrations described in the Bible. Also, etymologically, some archaeologists believe that the Hebrew term Hebrew derives from another ancient Near Eastern word, Habiru, which refers to a nomadic tribe that was wandering around in the Middle East. So there is this sense of wandering from place to place or migration. Let me give you a couple of more contemporary examples about the centrality of migration in Jewish history. The historian Shimon Dubnov, who really was the first notable Jewish historian from Russia, and really invented the study of Russian Jewish history about a century and a quarter ago. One of the ways in which he characterized Jewish history as a whole was a series of shifts in the center of Jewish life. So according to Dubnov, the center of world Jewry began in Jerusalem in the land of Israel, eventually went to Babylon, eventually went to Spain, and to Central Europe, and to Eastern Europe, and finally to North America, and then back to Israel. But the point being that when one describes Jewish history as a series of shifts in the center of Jewish life, the mechanism of these shifts is a migration movement. So the decline of one center and the rise of another was animated, was set in motion in no small part by a migration of Jews from place to place. And more specifically, American Jewish history has been characterized or conceptualized, or at least organized around a series of Jewish migrations from Central Europe, from Eastern Europe, and most recently, as I mentioned, from the former Soviet Union. So the very question of migration is central to Jewish history. And there's no point in Jewish history where you're not going to find a major community that's only a few generations removed from some large migration. Now, in order to really discuss this topic with some nuance, we have to distinguish between really two kinds of migration movements, or two reasons why Jews move from place to place. And here, the terms I would use, I would differentiate between would be migrant and refugee. Migrant and refugee. And I have to admit, to tell you that I make this distinction based on this terrific new book that just came out by the historian Robert Chazen called Refugees and Migrants. He's writing about Jewish migrations in the Middle Ages. So first, what's the difference between when we say migrant versus refugee? Certainly the way Chazen distinguishes, and I think this is an excellent way to distinguish, is when we talk about a migrant, but when we talk about a refugee, it has the connotation of being coerced to leave. A refugee is an individual or a group of individuals who cannot stay where they are. They have to leave. Migrants are choosing to leave. In other words, volition is one difference. The other difference, or a related difference, is that as a rule, refugees cannot return to where they came from. There's usually a reason why not only they had to leave, but why they can't go back. Whereas migrants, in some cases, they move from place to place, but maybe they can return one day. Now, I would say in the classical Jewish way, classical Jewish understanding of history, and here by classical, I mean more specifically a rabbinic way, there are two terms which in some sense I would suggest parallel the terms refugee and migrant. And these are the terms exile and diaspora. Now, in strictly geographic terms, the terms exile and diaspora refer to the same geographic area. They refer to the area outside the homeland. So saying that Jews in exile or Jews living in the Jewish diaspora, it refers to the same area everywhere outside of Israel. But the terms, beyond that, the terms have very different connotations. Exile has a sense of dislocation, of being uprooted, of being forced to leave, and living in exile is a situation one wants to remedy. Diaspora, on the other hand, is a more benign version of leaving one's homeland, or a more neutral version, perhaps. It comes from the Greek word, which simply means to disperse. And so the sense of living in diaspora, though there's still a yearning, perhaps, in some sense, to return, diaspora connotes a sense or a greater sense of rootedness than exile connotes. Now, the notion of exile in Jewish tradition is something which Jews recite every day in prayers. I'll give you one example. In a prayer that's recited on the Jewish holiday, Jews recite the phrase, Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu. Because of our iniquities, we have been exiled from our land. And it gives the sense that not only is exile something that's involuntary, and it has a sense of dislocation, but it's also divinely ordained. Jews are in exile for a reason, out of divine retribution. And that is the classical or rabbinic explanation for why Jews are in exile. Now, alongside this Jewish explanation of exile is a related Christian explanation of Jews being in exile. From a Christian point of view, Jews are also, the exile is a result of divine retribution, but whereas the Jewish notion of divine retribution is Jews failing to obey the commandments associated with the covenant between God and Moses and God and Abraham, from a Christian point of view, exile is divine retribution for rejecting the divinity of Christ. That's why Jews live in a permanent state of exile. It is divine punishment. So it has that sense. Now, diaspora, or the Hebrew word for diaspora is tfutza. As I said, a more neutral sense of dispersion and a sense of rootedness. To make it clear, even in the Hebrew Bible itself, there are expressions of exile versus diaspora. Let me contrast the two. A strong expression of exile comes from something like Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is the one that begins, "By the waters of Babylon we lay down and wept as we remember Zion." This is associated with Jews who were exiled from the land of Israel by the Babylonians in the 6th century BCE, but it has a sense of not only lament, but of despair. These are Jews questioning whether life as Jews can even go on. It's not only a sense of being dislocated, it's an utter sense of despair. Contrast that to, let's say, Jeremiah 29, in which the prophet Jeremiah speaks to those who were sent into exile. And what he tells them is, and I quote, "Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and dwell in them. Find husbands for your daughters and wives for your sons. Seek the welfare for the city in which you live, which you have been exiled to." Jeremiah gives a sense that it's possible to live as a Jew outside the land of Israel. And while he didn't have the term diaspora, that's a Greek term that was coined several centuries later, the concept he is defining here is a concept of diaspora. A concept of Jews can be rooted in the diaspora. Even though there's going to be a perpetual yearning to return to Zion, Jeremiah says, while Jews are living in the diaspora, they can have a full life and a meaningful life. Exile connotes something different. Exile connotes something different. So I would say that the term exile corresponds to refugees. Those in exile tend to be refugees, and diaspora corresponds more closely to migrants. A sense of being able to choose. Now, when we move from the classic rabbinic understanding of migration and of exile and diaspora to the way that historians have understood migration in Jewish history, the first thing we see, and this is not surprising, is replacing theological explanations for exile and diaspora with natural causes. So for historians, why do Jews move from place to place? The reasons are economic, and they are political, and they are cultural, and they have to do with the specific context in which they were living. But here too, the emphasis, even for until recently, historians studying the phenomena tended to continue to emphasize expulsion and persecution as the main driving forces behind Jewish migration. they would point to periods of expulsion. This is why Jews move, and they tended to see, therefore, Jews moving from place to place as refugees from expulsions and persecutions. But more recently, historians have begun to reconsider this in a broader context and in a more nuanced context, and that's what I would like to explore. And this more nuanced, first and foremost, I should say that historians reconsidering this, the centrality of expulsion as the driving force in Jews moving from place to place, the driving force behind this image of the wandering Jew, they point to the fact that expulsions were not that frequent in Jewish history. In fact, there are broad periods, there are broad gaps between one set of expulsions and another. So Jews were expelled by the but from the land of Israel by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, by the Romans in 70 CE, and the next expulsion really happens in England in 1290. That's a long period of time. So these ancient expulsions aside, in the history of medieval, of Jews in the Middle Ages, there is a period of expulsions. It's really England in 1290 till Spain in 1492. But in the broad sweep of Jewish history, in many ways, these expulsions are more exceptional than they are typical. After 1492, there are smaller localized expulsions in Central Europe and in the Italian states, but no wholesale expulsion really until the 20th century. Perhaps one might describe Jews leaving Middle Eastern countries at the mid 20th century as an expulsion, though that's questionable. Therefore, it makes more sense, and this is something that Chazen points out very effectively. It makes sense to see Jewish migration more as migrants choosing to move from place to place, rather than Jews being forced to move from place to place. But here too, I have to qualify that, because if migrant and refugee represent, let's say, two very distinct possibilities, there is a broad gray area in between. In other words, there are many instances in Jewish history where there's no formal edict of expulsion, but conditions become more and more difficult for Jews to remain. And I think the term I'd like to apply to this gray area, well, really the best I could come up with is not a term one normally associates with history, but a term one normally associates with real estate law. And this is the term constructive eviction. Now, if I understand the term constructive eviction properly, this means a landlord is not formally evicting the tenant, but the landlord is making the conditions of the domicile so difficult and uninhabitable that the tenant has no choice but to leave. In other words, technically and legally, it's still the tenant's choice to leave, but the constructive eviction by the landlord is making that choice a pretty narrow choice. This constructive eviction, I think, this is the typical situation for Jews. Apart from this period of expulsions, there are instances where conditions got simply too difficult. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Poland in 1648, there were a series of, well, there's an uprising, as it's called in Ukrainian history, known as the Khmelnytsky uprising. Khmelnytsky was a Ukrainian Cossack who rose in revolt against the king of Poland, and Jews, being the financial agents of leading Polish nobles and the king himself, they really became a target of this uprising. It was a difficult situation for Jews in southeastern Poland and prompted a migration of Jews out of southern Poland. Now, there was no formal edict of expulsion, but this is an example where during this uprising and during the ensuing century of wars that plagued the region, it was difficult, if not impossible, for Jews to remain. A more recent example would be the pogroms in Russia in the late 19th and early 20th century, in 1881, in 1903 to 1906. A series of pogroms break out where these are riots against Russian Jews, which are the law enforcement is not trying to stop, but rather actually organizes it. Local law enforcement actually participates in. And in 1881, the pogroms are coupled by a series of anti-Jewish economic restrictions known as the May laws, where it becomes virtually impossible for Jews to earn a living, or most Jews to earn a living. And this prompts a mass exodus, a mass migration of Jews out of the Russian Pale of Settlement. Also, not a specific edict of expulsion. The Tsar never said, Jews, you must leave. But after 1881, several million Jews leave the Pale of Settlement. They leave the small towns where they were living. Now, they chose to leave, but did they really have a choice? That, of course, is this notion of constructive eviction. Now, another important way to understand the dynamics of Jewish migration is not simply say Jews move from one place to another, but to note that Jewish migration was a tri-directional migration. It moved in three directions. Now, when I say three directions, I'm not simply talking in geographic terms. Let me explain. First, and most obvious, there was a directional movement of Jews. Each migration movement of Jews had a directional movement. So in the 9th century CE, there is a northward movement of Jews from the land of Israel and other parts of the Byzantine Empire northward through Italy to Central Europe. This is the beginnings of Ashkenazic Jews. Around the same time, there is a westward movement of Jews from what is now Iraq, the area near Baghdad, westward in the Islamic world, many of whom wound up in Spain. This is the beginning of those Jews who are known as Sephardic Jews today. And in the 13th century, there is an eastward movement of Jews from Central Europe to Poland. These are the origins of Polish Jews. And the 15th century, there's a movement from Spain following the expulsion to the Ottoman Empire. So Jewish migration has a directional component to it, but that's only one. The second component I would describe as Jews moving from smaller towns. Well, I'll do that one third. Jews moving from older, more established areas of settlement to frontier areas. So, for example, the migrations I mentioned to Central Europe from the land of Israel. At that point, Central Europe was the frontier of Christendom. Jews who went to Spain, to Muslim Spain, they went to the frontier of the world of Islam. When Jews first went eastward to Poland, Poland was another frontier of the world of Christendom. And of course, since the 17th century, the massive Jewish movement westward to the New World is also moving to a frontier. So older, more established to newer frontier regions is a second dimension of Jewish migration. And the third, a more demographic dimension, this is something more recent. Since in the last 150 or 200 years, there has been a movement of Jews from smaller towns and villages to larger towns and cities. Urbanization is an important dimension of Jewish migration. So, for example, Jews leaving the small towns of Russia following the pogroms of 1880, most of them wound up in North America. But there were many Jews who left the small towns who moved to bigger cities like Warsaw or Kiev or Vienna or Budapest. There is that urban oriented migration as well. Now, the other thing we can say about Jewish migration is where Jews chose to move reflected not only an immediate decision, but when we look back, it also reflected a broader sense of the future of Jewish life in the diaspora as a whole. Where Jews chose to go was their way of answering, well, we have to leave our homes now. We're leaving our homes now. But what does that mean for the future? Where is the best place to live, to raise our family, to have a real future? And here, I'll give you an example of the migration of Jews out of Muslim Spain in the 11th century. Now, the short version of the story is Muslim Spain, which had been unusually hospitable to Jews for about a century and a half. There was an invasion of less tolerant Muslims, Berbers from North Africa, which made the region less tolerant. And so Jews began leaving Muslim Spain, but they went in three directions. They went to three places. There were some Jews who moved from Muslim Spain northward to Christian Spain. And for these Jews, their sense of the future was, well, Spain, the area of Spain is still fine, just not Muslim Spain. There were Jews who moved elsewhere in the Muslim world. The Jews who, for example, the family of Maimonides moved from Spain to Morocco, and then to Egypt. For their sense of the future was the world of Islam is fine, just not the world of Muslim Spain. And of course, there were some Jews who were leaving Spain. They headed towards or tried to reach the land of Israel. For these Jews, and this was a small minority, their sense was there really is no future in the diaspora for Jews anywhere. The one course of action left in this time of dislocation is to go to the land of Israel and wait for the Messiah there. But the typical responses were to move elsewhere in the world of Islam or elsewhere in Spain. And this points to another aspect of Jewish migration, is that as a rule, when Jews migrated, more so as migrants, but also as refugees as well, they tended to choose to go, or they tended to go to the nearest or most convenient destination available. If they didn't have to go halfway around the world, they didn't. So when Jews were expelled from England, they went to France. When Jews were expelled from France, when they were expelled from the Kingdom of France, either they went to parts of what is today France that weren't part of that kingdom yet, like Burgundy, or they went eastward to the Holy Roman Empire, or they went to Spain. And when Jews were expelled from Spain, Western Europe was more or less off limits at this point. The easiest place to go was along the Mediterranean and settle in the Ottoman Empire. But in each of these cases, that was the most convenient place to go. That was it was the most convenient destination, the least difficult. What's remarkable is prior to the 20th century, Jews who were moving from place to place, they found a clear destination. The choice of what this nearest, most convenient place was pretty obvious. And the choice of where the best future lay at that particular moment was pretty obvious prior to the 20th century. Let me give you a couple of examples. The expulsion from Spain in 1492, this was a traumatic moment. This was the end of a Jewish community that had been in Spain for 700 years, even if you just count since the Muslim conquest. In other words, twice as long as Jews have been in America. They had deep roots. They were deeply connected. It was very difficult to leave. And when they were expelled from Spain, they pondered where to go, but they discovered as the best place to go was going to be the Ottoman Empire. And they discovered not the Ottoman Empire, not only as a refuge, but also as this, well, let me give it to you in the words of a Jew who was among those who left Spain. Now, this was a Portuguese Jew whose name was Samuel Usque. And at the beginning of the 16th century, he wrote a text called Consolations for the Tribulations of Israel. Basically, he's trying to console those Jews who left Spain and were uncertain about the future. And he makes a series of 8 points about why the future was going to be okay. And I want to read you the eighth. The eighth quote, "The eighth and most signal way by which you will rise to a higher degree of consolation is in the great nation of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. This country is like a broad and expansive sea, which our Lord has opened with the rod of his mercy, as Moses did for you in the Exodus from Egypt, so that the swells of your present misfortunes, which relentlessly pursue you in all kingdoms of Europe, like the infinite multitude of Egyptians, might cease and be consumed by it. Here, the gates of liberty are always wide open for you, that you may fully practice your Judaism. They are never closed. Here you may restore your character, transform your nature." In other words, Usque saw the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s. He compared Jews going from Spain to the Ottoman Empire to the Jews in the Bible leaving Egypt during the Exodus, heading for the promised land. Now, we can allow him some hyperbole, but it's still remarkable. From his point of view, there was an obvious destination for Jews to go when they had to leave Spain, and there were real possibilities there. Now, let me give you another more recent example. This is from an essay written by Leopold Kompert, who was a German Jewish intellectual. He wrote this in 1848, in May of 1848. Now, one word of background. This is a moment where a series of liberal revolutions had broken out across Central Europe. It was the moment when Jews who lived in Central Europe, who were still living for the most part as second-class citizens, this is the moment they hoped they would become citizens like Jews in France and England and the United States. But at the beginning of the outbreak of these revolutions, there were anti-Jewish riots. There was a backlash to the possibility of Jews becoming citizens. And so there was this impulse to leave. Now, Comport was among those Jews who was highly disillusioned by the fact that citizenship wasn't going to be arriving right away. There was this opposition to Jews serving in the revolutionary armies, fighting for liberty. And he wrote an essay in May of 1848 called Off to America. He identified America as the place where Jews should go at this point. And let me quote a little bit from it. The sun of freedom has risen above the fatherland, meaning German Central Europe. But for us, it is nothing but a bloody northern light. He's disappointed, no citizenship, anti-Jewish riots, amidst this call for liberty. The larks of redemption warble in the sky. For us, however, they are the screaming harbingers of a terrible storm. We have reached the point where at this very hour, which has brought freedom into the land, we have no other wish but to avoid this kind of freedom. In other words, freedom for everyone else means riots against Jews. For all those who have gained nothing from this so-called freedom, all those who feel in their hearts that it will take a long time before there is peace in the fatherland, to all those we say, salvation can only be sought in America. America is this shining beacon where a group that is a group of second class subjects, denied citizenship, persecuted for who they are, this is where they should be. In some ways, I would say what Comport wrote about America in 1848 anticipates what Emma Lazarus wrote about America a generation or two later in the New Colossus, the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor. A similar kind of idea. Now, what Comport, what this essay points to is the fact that Jewish migration from one place to another elicited backlash. Now, this was more true in the 19th and 20th century than previously. One of the things that's unusual about more recent Jewish migration in the 19th and 20th century is that there was more resistance to it. We don't have that much evidence of Jews arriving in a country and immediately there being some resistance to it. And this points to, well, the unusual nature of the 20th century and the history of Jewish migration. So I mentioned that for the most part, Jews, when they were leaving one country, they had a clear idea in mind as to where they were going. But in the 20th century, we have the exception to that rule. In the 1920s and 1930s, what we might call the push, the impulse to leave, particularly Germany and Nazi-controlled Europe, but also from, in the end of the 1930s, Roman Mowski's Poland, Miklos Horthy's Hungary. There was this growing desire, a growing need for Jews to leave and to escape anti-Semitic persecution, which was intensifying. But unlike previous moments, there was a clear sense of where Jews wanted to go, but there was no available destination. So most Jews wanting to leave wanted to go either to America or to Palestine. But both those were the two options. Those were the two main options. But both of these options were closed. So America had been closed to Jewish immigration by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, and Palestine had been closed to Jewish immigration by the British Mandate. Now, for a variety of reasons in each case, but for Jews trapped in Europe and between the two world wars, the natural mechanism or the natural course of events where Jews facing a push, facing this is really an intense case of constructive eviction, wanted to leave, couldn't because there was no place to go. But I would suggest that that was a tragic exception in the 20th century. But it's exceptional in terms of there being no destination. But in a broader sense, it may not be as exceptional in terms of backlash of the arrival of Jewish immigrants. This is something we see in a most pronounced way, really in the last century and a half. And the term that encapsulated this backlash to Jewish immigration, whether Jewish refugees or Jewish migrants, the term that encapsulated it was what was known as the Ostjuden problem. Now, Ostjuden is a German word or a Yiddish word, which literally means Eastern Jews, but really refers to Eastern European Jews. And the image of the Ostjude, of the Eastern European Jew, wasn't simply a Jew from a particular part of the world, but it was a Jew who was unacculturated, old-fashioned, had no interest in embracing, becoming part of the social mainstream, spoke a different language, was poor, didn't do anything productive, was probably a petty merchant or a pawnbroker, didn't contribute in any way, and was largely just a drain on society and the economy, really didn't bring anything. Now, the Ostjuden problem, while there are elements of it through much of the 19th century, becomes more pronounced when there is this mass exodus of Jews out of the Russian Empire. This is when Eastern European Jews begin to move westward in a more intense and pronounced sort of way. And when we think about the places where Jews wanted to go, the directions of Jewish migration, at this point, the natural frontier was America, and many of these Jews wound up in America. But the other direction, the big cities of Europe, there was resistance to allowing these Jews to come in. They really didn't want them there. And the resistance came not only from non-Jews, but from acculturated Jewish communities themselves. Jews who finally, at the end of the 19th century, had finally become citizens and felt like they were socially accepted, and as part of the contract of citizenship, had become more acculturated, had immersed themselves in mainstream culture. They were concerned less that the arrival of a mass of unacculturated Jews would rock the boat and undermine their own status, and they pushed back. They didn't want Jews coming in. Now, look, ultimately, they wound up allowing the Jews. They wound up letting them in. So by the beginning of the 20th century, there is a large community of Ostjuden in Vienna and in Berlin and in Budapest and other cities. But there was this resistance. But the real resistance came from those elements of society who were opposed to Jewish emancipation, who were opposed to the inclusion of Jews in mainstream society, the inclusion of any Jews, who didn't like the idea that Jews had become citizens at all. And they used the Ostjuden problem as a pretense or an excuse to undo the improving status of Jews who were already there. I'll give you an example. In Hungary, there was let's call him a reactionary conservative politician whose name was Viktor Istoczi. And in the 1880s, when this possibility of this massive influx of Ostjuden really loomed, he spoke out in parliament. He wanted hard and fast restrictions placed on Jews. It didn't succeed. It didn't work. But the point is, the backlash was there. Now, the individual who really recognized this potential for backlash was none other than Theodore Herzl. Herzl was one of the founders of the Zionist movement. And in terms of a vision of the future, he saw that ultimately the diaspora would become uninhabitable for Jews. He didn't turn out to be right, although he was right about certain parts of the world. But one of the first essays he wrote specifically about Jews, as opposed to other things, he was a journalist, he wrote about literature. In 1896, he published an article in the Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish newspaper in London, called A Solution to the Jewish Question. He's envisioning the future. Now, spoiler alert, his solution is going to be Zionism. But before he gets to that, he makes the following statement about the impact of Jewish immigration. And I quote, "The Jewish question," meaning this debate over whether or not Jews can be included, this debate over citizenship, "the Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers." Listen to this. "Where it does not exist, it will be brought by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution." Now, writing in 1896, the place he is talking about, perhaps more than any other place, is America. Because at the turn of the 20th century, yes, there was anti-Semitism in America, but for the most part, Jews lived relatively inconspicuously. relatively inconspicuously. But it's in the 20th century with this massive influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe where conservative American society, which is becoming more and more xenophobic, especially after the First World War, but even before, begins to push back. And what does this pushback look like in this case? What does this pushback in America look like? I would say it has 5 dimensions, or there's those who oppose what they call the Ostjuden invasion. They refer to, or they object to 5 dimensions of it. Now, as I read these, what I would suggest to you is that there are some eerie parallels between the list I'm about to read and the recent xenophobic anti-immigrant discourse we've heard in the last half a decade or decade. So let me tell you what they were. First of all, there was an economic dimension. All these immigrants are going to take away jobs. Secondly, there was a cultural dimension. The Ostjuden unwilling to assimilate, and assimilation at the beginning of the 20th century, the metaphor for it was the melting pot. Ostjuden are going to be unwilling to abide by this expectation that they become like everyone else, and they'll undermine American identity. That's 2. There's a social dimension. The social dimension is these Jewish immigrants from Russia, they are criminals, and they are going to bring crime into America. And there's a specific moment where that one comes to head. In 1908, the police chief of New York City, Police Chief Binghamton, he published an essay in a journal called the Northern Review, a conservative journal, in which he made the claim that the rise in the crime rate in New York City, and especially in the rate of violent crime, was due largely, if not entirely, to the influx of Jewish immigrants from Russia. In other words, he blamed crime, the rising crime, on Jewish immigrants. And fourth, there's a public health dimension. In 1892, there was an outbreak of cholera in New York City, which some city officials blamed on Jewish immigrants from Russia who had brought the disease in their migration. And finally, there was a political dimension. There was a fear that, and this is most vividly expressed by someone like Henry Ford, who believed, Henry Ford bought into the stereotype that all Jews are communists and all communists are Jews, and therefore he believed that Jewish immigrants are going to import radical extreme ideas like communism. Just to be clear, in 1920, when Henry Ford wrote that, a communist wasn't just a person with a particular political outlook. A communist was the most terrifying person in the world. Communists were feared not only as having a certain ideology, but as being violent revolutionaries. So I would suggest that the phrase, all Jews are communists in 1920 is very similar to all Muslims are terrorists in 2020. They're very similar ideas. We can come back to that one if you want. The point being is that in America, this massive influx of Ostjuden prompted a backlash, and this backlash culminated in the aforementioned Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. Now, this was effectively a ban on Jewish immigration. Now, if you read the Johnson-Reed Act, you're not going to find Jews or Jewish immigration or Ostjuden in it. It wasn't specifically directed at Jews, but the way it was formulated, basically it said that you take the year 1890 as a baseline of data, and for immigration from each European country, a quota is established which would make sure that the number of immigrants from each country in Europe could only be a certain percentage of the number of people who were already in the United States in 1890. But the massive influx of Jews and others from Eastern Europe hadn't gone very far by 1890. So this was a way of allowing lots of immigrants in from Central Europe and Western Europe and Northern Europe, and restricting immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, movements where the numbers were much smaller in 1890. But for Jews, this effectively brought an end to not only Jewish immigration to America, but remember, America as a refuge for Jews who in Europe were going to suffer more and more difficult conditions. And so in the 20s and 30s, the Jewish refugee problem doesn't mean what to do with the Jewish refugees who have arrived somewhere, but it referred to what to do with Jewish refugees trapped in Europe who are unable to get out, where they have no place to go. Now, let's be fair. In hindsight, we know what happened after Johnson Reed. The members of Congress who legislated it, they didn't know. But still, it reflected a kind of xenophobia that was directed largely at Jewish immigrants and specifically at Ostjuden. Now, let me make one last point. That being that this notion that Ostjuden were unwilling to adapt, unwilling to assimilate. This is something which really, in the broader history of Jewish migration, really is erroneous, because wherever Jews went, almost without exception, to some degree, they embraced at least part of the culture that they moved into. If nothing else, when Jews moved to place, most of the places where Jews moved, they fashioned a Jewish dialect of the vernacular language. Moreover, most places where Jews moved, where Jews were welcomed, Jews contributed to the local economy. In fact, one of the reasons why there was relatively little backlash to Jews is that Jews were seen as contributors to parts of the economy. Probably the most notable example of that, at the end of the 10th century, there were very few Jewish communities in what is today Germany. The largest was Mainz, and in Mainz there was a fire, and the Jews living in Mainz, their homes were burned down. They needed a new place to live. Nearby there was a town called Speyer, which had no Jews, but the leader of Speyer, Bishop Rüdiger of Speyer, he saw an opportunity, and he extended an invitation of Jews who had been displaced from their homes in Mainz to come live in Speyer. Now, this is a bishop. This is a Catholic bishop who believed in this notion that Jewish wandering and suffering is part of divine retribution. But he set that aside. He took off his theological hat and put on his political hat, because he wasn't only the bishop, he was the leader of the city. He really ran the city of Speyer. And in the charter he gave to Jews to entice them, to invite them to Speyer, the opening line says, "When I wanted to transform Speyer from a village into a town, I thought it best to invite Jews." There was this notion that Jews will stimulate commerce, stimulate trade, stimulate urban life. And this is something which is going to be echoed from place to place. And so too, Jews who arrived in America, who were expected not to assimilate, eventually did. In fact, there's a weird disjunction here. Those who opposed Jewish immigration, they assumed Jews weren't going to assimilate. Most Jews, when it came to thinking about going to America, they were afraid that Jews were going to assimilate too much. In fact, when it came, for Ostjuden, when it came to decide about going to America, the one subset of the Jewish community from Eastern Europe that didn't go were those who were religiously traditional, who were not wanting to assimilate. They stayed at home because America had a reputation as the place where religion goes to die. But those who came, not only did they embrace the possibilities and the challenges of an open society and mainstream culture, but they were able to, for the last century, this is one of the characteristic features of American Jewish history in the last century, is they were able to embrace mainstream American society and culture, to succeed, to attain a measure of upward mobility, but also to preserve some measure of Jewish identity. Now, the balance between those two is a matter of debate. In fact, I would say two things. First of all, historians of American Jewry, they tend to divide between pessimists and optimists. Pessimists assume that, the story of Jews in America is a series of migrations, and each migration eventually dried up through assimilation. So eventually there will be no more Jews in America. But the optimists will point out rather that yes, of course, Jews become assimilated, Jews become American. That's what Jews in America do. This is facilitated, among other things, by the openness of American society to Jews. But by the same token, Jews are able to set limits and have been able to maintain a certain integrity of the Jewish community. It's interesting that every generation of Jews that in America for the last 300 years assumed it was the last. This is true in the 20th century and before. But what's amazing is this massive influx of Jews from Eastern Europe 125 years ago, the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of this wave they still comprise the core elements of the Jewish community. So what it tells us is that Jewish migration seen in this broad picture, this combination of refugees and migrants, it is a mixed bag. It is a nuanced and complex phenomenon, and it is also something ongoing. And I'll leave you with this one last example, because apart from the Jews from the former Soviet Union, the other influx of Jews, most recent immigrant of Jews to the United States were Persian Jews, Jews from Iran, most of whom came after 1979, some of whom came before. And here we see a very interesting difference, because those who came before 1979, in other words, those who opted to come, those who were more migrants than refugees, were more open and more willing to embrace American culture. Those who came after 1979 as refugees, they've been much more tenacious in trying to preserve their own Persian Jewish culture against what they see as the pressures of American society. They've been more tenacious about that, and at the same time, they are more tenacious about resisting the impact of American society. But their children and their grandchildren, whether in New York or LA or anywhere else, they are becoming Americans, and this is simply the latest in a series of steps in this broad process of Jewish migration. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now we are moving to the Q&A portion. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, unmute your mic, or place any questions in our chat. Thank you. All right, we have one person with their hand up. You can just unmute your mic. I think Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric. Professor Lupovitch, I forgot that it was supposed to start at 12:30 today, so I just came thinking I was going to be in the middle of class. Could you give me like an extremely short summary of what you just finished presenting?
Okay, Eric. All right, the challenge is to say what I just said in 45 minutes and 10 seconds. I'm up to the challenge. Migrants and refugees refer to different things. Migrant refers to moving voluntarily, refugees to moving involuntarily as a response to persecution. For the most part, Jewish migration has been more in the direction of migrant than refugee. And then I gave some specific examples in some specific places. It's also something that's been a core part of Jewish history for the last 2,500 years. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. Okay. I'm sorry for the rest of you. You had to listen for 45 minutes just to hear me say that. Go ahead, Eric.
I'm sure they enjoyed it. You're an excellent speaker. So would you say that being a migrant or a refugee is like kind of essential to the Jewish identity now? Is it like inseparable?
Well, one of the things I said at the outset is that most Jews now are several generations removed from being migrants. Most Jews in America, for example, are third or fourth generation immigrants. So the memory of migration is important. Everyone has a story. You know, Jews are not only 2 or 3 generations removed from my family once lived someplace else. So in the immediate day-to-day experience, it's not the experience of a refugee or of a migrant. But, and here I think is the point, there is real empathy, I would say among the majority of American Jews for the situation of other groups, other migrant and refugee groups. I mean, I think the most dramatic example was, the shooting of the synagogue in Pittsburgh was prompted by the fact that that congregation is deeply involved in an organization known as HIAS, which the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, which 100 years ago started as a way to help Jewish immigrants. But once Jewish immigration was no longer a main issue, other than during the 1990s with Jews from the former Soviet Union, what HIAS does mostly now is to help other immigrants, Muslims, Latinos, and others. And the shooter, the reason he chose that target was to strike a blow against these Jews who are helping these other immigrants come in. So yes, in the psyche, in the identity of Jews, the importance of helping immigrants and refugees is deeply important. It's not as personal as it once was, though, but no less important.
Howard, there's a question in the chat,
Okay.
which says, what accounts for the current anti-Semitic movements in Europe, and is
it causing Jews to migrate? That is a great question. So the causes are more than one. I mean, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism. Those are sort of the crass or approximate terms for it. So right-wing anti-Semitism, there is this movement to the right. So in a place like Hungary, the right-wing ruler of Hungary is becoming, he's anti-Semitic. So is the one in Poland, and conditions for Jews there are becoming more difficult. But left-wing anti-Semitism really these days is revolving more than anything else, or it's expressed oftentimes as criticism of the policies of the state of Israel. And it's finding more followers in the Muslim community. And especially in France, this is causing problems. In England too, or in Great Britain too, in the party of Jeremy Corbyn, it's also causing problems. So these are the underlying causes. Is it causing Jews to migrate? A couple of years ago, there was an expectation that there was going to be this exodus of French Jews to Israel, and there was a statistic said that there are all these French Jews now living in Israel. Turns out that a good many of them living in Israel meant they own a residence in Israel, but they only vacation there. They don't live there. So I would say, if the current situation in Europe got worse, we could see an exodus. I think the line in the sand when it comes to anti-Semitism prompting an exodus, a migration out, emigration, the line in the sand is anti-Jewish laws. When it's specific incidents, even when the incidents are violent, it prompts some fear, but the real taking it to the next level, the quantum leap, is when Jews feel that their rights are being legally restricted. And I'm not sure if Jews in France or elsewhere in Europe are feeling that yet, though I have to say we're closer now than we were 5 years ago. There's no question about that. Okay. Another question in the chat asks, where are Jews migrating next? That's a great question. I've heard of Jews moving back to Germany. Well, there's two things. Yes, there are Jews who are beginning to return to Germany and other parts of East Central Europe. Which really had very few Jews living there after the Second World War, after the Holocaust. And there was a real reluctance of Jews to go back there because in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The memories were just too powerful. But 2 or 3 generations later, there are Jews going there now. Some of these are Jews who left the former Soviet Union heading westward. Instead of going all the way to the United States, they just stopped in Germany. Some of them are Israelis who are there for business reasons. So there is a small but growing Jewish community. Will there be a rise, and a new center of Jewish life there? I think it's too soon. I think it's too soon to tell. The Jewish community there is still pretty small, especially compared to what it once was. It's greater than 0, which it was for a long time, or minuscule. It's bigger, but it still hasn't reached that point where it's not clear what direction it's going to go. Where else might Jews go? I mean, it's a great question. It seems like much of the Jews have traversed much of the world. I mean, I think the big question mark, the real question is, will Jews begin to go to China? Which is a very different part of the world and a very different culture, and would require a real it would have challenges in terms of acclimation. But at this point, North America is still a place where Jews can live. For all the rising anti-Semitism in America, for American Jews, I mean, there is a level of comfort. If nothing else, the willingness of Jews to fight with each other so openly usually goes hand in hand with a sense of self-confidence and security. So if nothing else, that seems to be the case. So time will tell where Jews will go next, but I don't think it's clear yet.
There's a question there by Christopher Hernandez.
Yes. Okay, Chris, my student. Is there a different experience found in Jewish communities if they're founded by refugees as compared to emigres? The example I gave about Persian Jews from Iran is exactly that. Jews in Iran who came after 1979 are refugees from Iran. They didn't want to leave. They loved living there. They loved the Shah. They had a close relationship. The Shah protected them. When they came to America, it took them a while to accept being here. They're the ones who are much more tenacious about maintaining the Persian language. They're the ones who get very uncomfortable, never mind if one of their children marries someone who's not a Persian Jew. I mean, for most Jews, it's marrying within the faith, marrying another Jew. But for Persian Jews, it's even marrying someone Jewish who is not Persian is a major, as Ashkenazi Jews would say, a shanda, scandalous. Now, that's more true for Persian girls than for Persian boys. For some reason, Persian boys are allowed to marry non-Persians. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that old sort of patriarchal sense of dominance. I'm not exactly sure. But you can tell within the Persian community, those who came before 1979 are simply much more willing to seamlessly and unselfconsciously live here with one foot in the world of Persian culture and one foot in the world of American culture. And those who came after 1979, not so much. And we would find something similar 100 years ago. There were Jews who came from Russia, the Jews who came who were fleeing from pogroms, who were really displaced. When they came here, they were determined to maintain their own sense of Jewishness and their own sense of Eastern European Jewishness, their local customs. But Jews who came not because they were fleeing pogroms or violence, but who came looking for economic reasons, who came in pursuit of economic opportunity, they tended to be more willing to live here unselfconsciously, like the Persian Jews before 1979. My grandparents.
All right, it is 1:32. Does anyone have any more questions? Feel free to raise your hand.
There's one more comment. There's an interesting comment from the chat, if I may. My grandparents, this person says, Lorraine says, my grandparents fled the pogroms in the early 1900s to Canada, the United States. In a twist, this saved 1.5 million lives from the Shoah. I thought of this a few years ago. Yes, that's an interesting point. There was a point where I think what you're saying is Jews who came in the early 20th century, in other words, they came to America before 1924, before the Johnson-Reed Act, which is a story of my own family too. I mean, the level of being fortunate here is remarkable. If my grandparents had waited even 10 more years to come, they would have been stuck in Europe during the Second World War. So the choice to leave, for Jews to leave Europe before 1924 and come to America really determined life and death of entire families in some sense. Thank you. Okay. I think.
Howard, Norma Shaw says that thank you very much for the presentation and hope that you do another soon. And I want to tell all those people who are still here that in the chat, you will see that the Humanities Center has started its recruitment program for the Brownbacks series next year. So Norma is suggesting that you sign up next year.
You got me. Hey, Walter, I can't say no to you. You want me, I'm happy to do it right now. I commit. You got me for next year.
Thank you.
Just tell me where and when and what you want me to talk about.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And if there are no more questions, Kennedy has a little thing that she always says at the end.
Yes, thank you so much for this really great presentation and being able to facilitate some meaningful discussion. We are so grateful and glad to have you and give you a platform to share all of this information. And yes, we definitely want you to come back. So I'll definitely mark your name down and reach out to you and give you an application. But on behalf of the Humanities Center, we're just so very thankful. And we do have two small gifts for you. It's a journal and a mask that we give to all of our speakers. But we're going to be reaching out to you later towards the end of the year to safely get these gifts to you. But again, thank you so much. And we're just so very thankful here at the Humanities Center to have speakers and to have your class and your students come and be a part of our audience. This is why we do what we do. So we thank you and we thank our audience. And if you have any last words before we go.
Thank you, everybody. Everyone be safe. Everyone be healthy.
Yes. All right. Well, everyone have a wonderful day. And this concludes our Brown Bag Talk. Have a good one, everyone. And yeah, be safe and stay warm.